the Panov attack, which we will discuss at a later point in a separate video. In this video we will focus on the move for c takes d5, knight f6, and here we will have a look at queen a4 check and knight c3. Let's start with the latter. Knight c3, knight takes d5, knight f3, and here black is at a crossroads. The main move is knight c6. I will not recommend this move for two reasons. First, this move leads to positions where you need to know a lot of theory. And you must also be ready to play an isolated pawn structure. This is not to everybody's taste, and I will not recommend it because it would be a tremendous effort to explain these structures, leave alone the actual amount of concrete theory. The second reason why I do not recommend it is because the move that I recommend also leads to very playable positions where you need less theoretical knowledge but still get very playable and potentially even better positions. e6 is the move that I recommend. White plays d4 and knight takes c3. B takes c3 and queen c7. White has so-called hanging pawns on c3 and d4, and they will influence the further course of the game. White will try to play very aggressively. He will play bishop d3, knight g5, and he will go for a kingside attack. Black will try to play against these hanging pawns long term. That means that a complicated struggle is ahead and both sides have their chances. In this position white has two reasonable moves, bishop d2 and queen b3. Queen b3 is not particularly problematic after bishop d6, bishop d3, b6, bishop e4, knight c6, bishop a3 takes, bishop b7. If black feels like castling, he can follow up with queen e7 and castles, and he will be very fine. A general rule of thumb is the more pieces get off the board, the less dynamic potential the white position has. That means these pawns c3 and d4 become weaker. Instead of queen b3 there is the move bishop d2, which makes a bit more sense. b6 and knight g5 is the critical test. If white goes castle, there is bishop b7, rook e1, bishop d6, queen e2, castle, and here the typical sacrifice bishop takes h7, the so-called Greek gift, does not work because of the king takes h7, knight g5, king g8, queen h5. Black has the move knight f6, after which black is completely winning. That means that 11 knight g5 is the most critical test, and in this position black needs to be a bit precise because it's not so easy to play. Knight f6, queen f3, rook b8. Castle, bishop d6, queen h3, white really tries to make pressure, but black has not castled yet. h6, rook e1, now castle, the knight has to retreat now, and bishop f4. This position was reached in the game Aronian against Carlsen, and I think black has solved all his opening problems already. Once the bishops are off the board, white will find it hard to create any dangerous play against the black king, which means that the hanging pawns become weaker and weaker. Black will probably follow up with bishop b7, rook bc8 and rook fd8. The knight can go to d5 in some variation, enhancing the pressure on the c3 pawn. And this position is very playable and I think also very pleasant to play for black. This is about it for knight c3. Let's go back to this position. When white can play queen a4 check. Knight d7, knight c3, g6, knight f3, bishop g7, bishop c4, castle d3, a6. So far both sides have developed their pieces. White has tried to stabilize the center, protect the pawn on d5 and hold on to it as long as possible. However, white is willing to give this pawn back under favorable circumstances later in the game, if he has the opportunity. Black must try to prevent exactly this. Black must try to win the pawn back without any weaknesses. White plays queen a3. b5 is indeed a threat. If white ignores this and goes castle, he will lose a piece. After b5, bishop takes, knight b6, protecting the rook a8, and following up with a takes b5 is winning on the spot. So queen a3 is a necessity here. Black plays b6. The idea is to develop the bishop on b7, putting the d5 pawn under pressure. Castle, bishop b7. Here white has two moves, either bishop e3 or rook e1. After bishop e3, we go b5, bishop b3, knight b6. And it is a nice picture to see how all black pieces, both knights, the bishop and the queen, put the d5 pawn under pressure. White has two moves here. He can either play his desired d6 move, trying to give the pawn back under favorable circumstances, or he can give up his pair of bishops in order to hold on to the pawn. If he plays bishop takes b6, we take it back. Queen takes e7, a very greedy approach. And black goes a5. Again, we need to make sure that we are fine as black. And we are very fine. As you can see, black has very active pieces, whereas white's pieces are very poorly coordinated. The bishop on b3 has no active purpose. All it does is protect the d5 pawn. Black is threatening to kick it with a4. The knight on c3 also has only defensive tasks. We can kick it with b4 if we want. And the queen on e7 is also in a bit of an awkward spot there, because we could play rook e8, and the queen has to go to a3 when b4 would pick up a piece. White plays queen e3, and even though black is 2 pawns down at the moment, we can take on e3. F takes, a4, bishop d1 and a3. And once again black is exerting very strong pressure on the queen side. Better on the diagonal, a1 to h8. The bishop g7 springs to life, and the structure c3, b2, a1 is very weakened, and even though black is 2 pawns down, black is already for choice. Let's have a look at 14 d6 instead of bishop takes b6. White is trying to give back the pawn, but black is well prepared for this. E takes d6, bishop f4, and now we can even take on f3. It's true we do give up our pair of bishops, and the bishop b7 was a nice piece, but now the white pawn structure is really in ashes, and after g takes f, d5 the position is still within the margin of equal, but who wouldn't rather be black here? Black is very fine. Instead, white could also play 12 rook e1. Rook e8. This move has two purposes. First, it defends the e7 pawn which was hanging, and secondly, and maybe even more importantly, it is preparing bishop f8. And the bishop on f8 is asking the queen on a3 some questions. White plays knight g5. There's one alternative, bishop e3. Then black can play b5, bishop b3, knight g4, d4, and as I said earlier, bishop f8. Very unpleasant for white. Because the queen has no real squares to go to, black is already at least equal. 13 knight g5. It is having an eye on the f7 pawn, threatening moves like d6. But this is no problem. Black plays rook c8. White has two moves, bishop e3 or d6. If d6, it seems like white managed to keep his extra pawn, and this is true, but he will not be able to enjoy his position anyway. Black has e6. Bishop f4, b5, kicking back the bishop, and knight c5. Rook a1, knight h5, attacking the bishop, bishop e3, knight takes b3, a takes, and f5. Black is yet again better. The threat is, or the immediate threat is f4, which cuts the connection between the bishop on e3 and the knight g5, which would win a piece. White needs to spend some time against this threat, but black has a very nice piece on b7, a very nice piece on g7, the rook on c8 is very active, and the pawn d6 is not long for this world. In other words, black is again slightly better. Instead, 14 bishop e3, black plays knight e5, rook ad1, and in this position black has three different approaches that all lead to a slightly favorable position for black. First there is the prosaic knight takes c4, d takes, and rook c4. Black has regained his pawn, he has two bishops and a very nice position. Also good is b5. Bishop b3, knight takes d5, knight takes, bishop takes, knight e4, bishop b3, queen takes b3, and knight c6. Black has control over d4 square, and the pawn d3 is very weak. Again, black is slightly better. It is not so much, but black is a bit better. Last but not least, h6 is also given the advantage to black. After knight e4, we can take knight takes e4, knight takes c4, d takes c4, rook takes c4, f3 and f5. Once again, the two bishops b7 and g7 are exerting a lot of pressure on the white center. The rook on c4 is very nicely placed. Black is for choice. This has been about it for the move second c5. As I said, after d5, e takes d, c takes d, d4 will be discussed in a separate video, because this is a bit of a serious weapon and you need to be well prepared for the pan-off. C takes d5, however, leads to positions that are very fine for black. You don't need to be afraid. In many lines you will be pawned down for a while, but as I showed you,